5,000 years of history, 1.3 billion people. As a standing ancient civilization, there is bound to be some stories. Grab a blanket, turn off your lights, and let's listen to 12 of these real Asian ghost stories from China. I am a half-believer. I come from China. The story I'm going to post here is not my own but my father's. I believe it's true because it's my father. I have to go back almost 16 years ago. My father was caught in a car accident when he was on a business trip. He was paralyzed and couldn't walk or take care of himself in many things. He'd become really sick. It had been a really hard time for him and for our family. But the focus is not the misery. My father became a Christian after he got injured. He had previously had doubt because in China, most people don't have that religion. But my father was changed by a single paranormal experience. He told me that one night, while feeling unwell with an infection, he was feeling very bad and not sleeping very well. He woke up and saw there was many people in his room. When they saw that my father had seen them, they didn't say anything, but all turned around and lined in a queue towards the window. My father was too afraid to keep his eyes open, but he was sure there were people in his room. He wasn't dreaming because later that night, he couldn't sleep anymore. The story is simple, but changed our mind for the paranormal. That's why my father became a Christian and I started going to church. But I am still lingering. I haven't experienced anything like that, but I have been having bad dreams. I have to admit that I do not have enough faith. I have read a lot of stories on this site, and to be frank, I have my doubts. Because writing a fictionist story online is not too difficult. There's simply no evidence, so I am doubtful most of the time. I have friends at church and they have very strong faith. I hope I can too, but I have too many things on my mind, too much desires and anxiety, and sometimes I just feel too tired. The most important thing is that I don't know my purpose anymore. I can see that life is short and I know I need to make it meaningful, but I just don't have faith. I don't have a goal and I'm doubtful of everything, even myself. Moving Buddha figurine. I bought a small brass Happy Buddha figure in the Lama Temple in Beijing when I visited China last summer. I gave it to my, at the time, boyfriend, but he returned it to me after we broke up, and now I have it again. It sits on a shelf with other small items in my bedroom, across from my bed. The past few months I've noticed that the Buddha would seem oddly close to the front edge of the shelf, but I just kept moving it back to where I had put it before, and didn't consider that it was weird. The Buddha would move 2 or 3 inches forward from its original place to the point where it would be touching the object in front of it, which is a small wooden box. Recently, about 2 weeks ago, my girlfriend and I had gained an interest in the paranormal and have been reading a lot of stories and posts here on Reddit Paranormal. Then a few days ago, I noticed that the Buddha had yet again moved forward, and I was in the middle of placing it back in its original spot when it hit me just how weird the change of location was. I notified my girlfriend of what was been happening, and I showed her where I normally put the Buddha and where it ends up. We placed it back in its original spot, and I told her that I would let her know if it moved again. And this morning I noticed that it moved again. So I'm wondering if anyone has experienced anything similar or read up on anything that could explain what may be going on. The Buddha is the only thing I've noticed moving, and there aren't any weird or creepy vibes that I get from the situation. Also, nothing else weird goes on in the house that I've noticed anyway. I'm just curious as to what's going on. Edit. I moved the figurine back a few inches so that it was nearly touching the wall, and it's been about 2 weeks and hasn't moved. The only thing I can think of is that there was a level of vibration that was conducted through the shelf, as a few Redditors had suggested, but was the most aggressive in the center where the figurine used to be. I shall continue keeping an eye on it though. Shanghai Hotel Incident. I heard this story from my auntie. Apparently, she has that extra eye, so sometimes she can see stuff. She said it was a night at a hotel in Shanghai. She woke up in the middle of the night to use the washroom. However, when she was going back to her bed, she saw a man dressed in those olden day shirts squatting on the floor in the corner of the room. It seemed like the man was actually afraid of her and just bent down his head, looking down on the floor. My auntie didn't bother about it and went to bed. She was quite calm about it, but I would have freaked out and ran out of the room. But it's because this isn't her first time encountering these things, and she said that as long as you don't disturb them, they will leave you alone, just like how the man appeared to be frightened and just squatted by the corner. I believe that they are everywhere, no matter how clean the place is supposed to be, but just don't run around disturbing them or irritating them on purpose. Ghost in our apartment. I was born in mainland China. When I was younger, my mom didn't have a lot of money, so we lived in some sketchy places for some years. There was this one year when I was around 12 years old. My mom rented a very small apartment beside my school, with only one room, one kitchen, and one bathroom. My mom and I shared a big bed, since there was only one room. We set up a dining table and a TV in front of the bed, so the bed doubled as a couch and dining chairs. One day after school, I came home. My mom was just on her way back from work, so I was home alone. At around 6 o'clock, it was already dark outside. I turned on the TV, and while watching the TV, I was facing the TV and walked backwards towards the bed, trying to sit down. Somehow, I started to sit down when I was still a few inches too far from the bed. I missed the bed, and obviously I lost my balance and scratched my entire back on the edge of the bed frame. It wasn't too bad of an injury, but it did scrape a lot of skin off my back and it bled. Now, mind you, I've been living in the same area for some months. I know very well how big the room is and how far the bed is from the TV. I walked backwards a few times before and I've never missed it, so I didn't feel like I was dumb enough to actually miss the bed myself. I could have sworn someone pushed me, or somehow the bed was momentarily furthered away from me. I didn't think much of it, and I didn't tell my mom any of those things. On the same night, my mom was sleeping on the outside of the bed. She felt a breath of air fly on her face and woke her up, but when she opened her eyes, no one was there. The next night, my mom took me to the crossroads beside our apartment, burned some paper money, what our traditional religion does, to kind of like send money to our relatives in the other world, and kept saying, "Okay, there's your money, time to go, don't come back, use the money, don't come back." Obviously, I was 12, I didn't know what she was doing, but everything returned back to normal afterwards. Then we moved out of the place as soon as the 1-year contract ended. A few years later, I grew up and asked my mom about it. She said the apartment's original tenant was an old couple. The man died of old age in the apartment, and around those 2 nights were his anniversary. He probably did push me and purposely woke up my mom because he was mad no one sent him paper money. Spooky lift. I used to travel very often. It was the first day of the Hungry Ghost Festival. That's the day when hungry ghosts and paranormal entities go out and roam the streets. I stayed at a hotel in Beijing. It was a gloomy day. I went out to buy food and some stuff, then came back to the hotel before night. It was going to sunset when I reached the hotel. I stayed at 15 floors up. I was inside the lift for a while. Then the door opened. I stepped outside, walked to my room, and to my surprise, it was on the 3rd floor. I guess I was too tired and went to the wrong floor. So I went back to the lift. It was the same lift again. I pressed the 15th floor. Waited a while. I felt the lift moving up. However, the door opened again at the 3rd floor. This time I felt uneasy. I pressed 15 floors many times to ensure the lift going up. The next floor it stopped at was the 13th floor. I pressed close button immediately and ran back to my room. When I reached my room, I had difficulties accessing my door. My colleagues were staying in the next door. I knocked his door, but no answers. Then I pressed the doorbells on the door, and the doorbell fell off. I felt scared and uneasy and tried to open my door this time, and I could open it. I quickly went into my room. The next day, I asked my colleague why he didn't answer the door when I called him. He said that he heard nothing. But I'm sure I know for a fact that I was knocking very hard. He wasn't sleeping or in the shower room. Well, that was creepy. It's very difficult to explain what actually happened. That strange feeling. I was barely 20 years old, and I was traveling with a small group of friends through China. And we were spending about 2 months in Qinghai province, which used to be a part of Tibet. Our destinations was a specific town to teach English, but we'd been stopping often in towns and small cities along the way. One day, we arrived in a rural town, very small, nothing unusual. We spent only a couple of days there, shopping for food at the markets and walking around to see the sights, although there weren't many. This was in the dead of winter, in February, and all the grass on the hills and plains around the town was dead and brown. The overall feeling was that of a normal kind of bleakness that any rural place has in the winter. At this time in my life, things were going amazingly, extraordinary well for me. And I'd say that because my teenagehood was rather dark overcast. But the overwhelming good luck of being able to travel and these close friends I've made in the last year had more than changed my feelings and attitudes towards life. It was like I was a whole new person. I was ecstatic to be in Tibet, went to sleep with a smile on my face every night. On our second day staying in the small town, I woke up feeling a little odd. Not bad, just odd. Like my normal thoughts and feelings had been turned down low, like on a dial. We all decided to go for a walk on the hills right behind the town, where there was a small summit with a pile of rocks and some prayer flags. To be honest, there were like little altars like these on every other hill, but it gave us something to do. As we hiked up the hills, we were behind the town. I started feeling stranger and stranger. I wasn't scared, and I didn't feel angry or any strong emotion. In fact, it was like emotion was trickling out of me somehow, and I was becoming blanker and blanker, emptier and emptier. My mind started feeling a little hazy, and more I felt like I simply didn't care about anything. A small and rapidly dwindling part of myself started to panic. Knew that something bad was happening, and it was like my own inner voice was slowly getting quieter and quieter. I remember we reached the little summit, and I simply sank to the ground next to the pile of rocks. Without meaning to, I started tuning out the voices around me and fixed all of my attention on the little pebbles in the dirt. I began tapping one against the other repeatedly. Do you know the kind of horror that is opposite of feeling scared or feeling anything at all? The kind of vicious hideousness of a fly buzzing against a closed window for hours on end in an empty room. That's what my mind was filling with. It was demonic in its meaninglessness. I felt my face and felt that I was grinning at nothing. Through all the emptiness, a thought floated to the forefront of my mind. You should just die. At first, it sounded totally reasonable, but something in me fought it, and I was momentarily troubled. Right then, my group started to walk down from the hill, and I followed. The further we walked, the more normal I felt. until we left the town that afternoon, and I was totally freaked out. When another girl, Hannah, mentioned in an odd offhand way that she had felt very strange and depressed while staying in there, I told her that I'd felt the same. When the group leader mentioned that a local had told him that the town had been plagued by a rash of young women under 25 committing suicide, Hannah and I went white. During my trip, in the summer of 2008, I went with a student ambassador program to China. I just turned 17 and was with about 50 other kids from Wisconsin and Ohio. It was really my first time being away from home and without any other relatives. The trip lasted 2.5 weeks, and the group toured Beijing, Shanghai, Xi'an, and Hong Kong. It was all a life-changing experience and fun. However, there were several things that happened while I was there, some things I really couldn't explain. Here are some of them. The first thing that happened was probably in my mind the most frightening to me. The group was in Xi'an. Actually, during our stay in Xi'an, we stayed overnight in a smaller village. We stayed in a hotel though, for one of the days, but I forgot what smaller village was called. Anyways, we were at this hotel and we basically had one floor to ourselves. There were 2 to 3 roommates in each room. We checked into the hotel and we were all getting set in our rooms. We were instructed to meet in the hotel restaurant at a certain time, which was about an hour after we were getting our things set in our room. I remember at one point leaving the hotel floor with someone for something, then coming back upstairs to our floor. There were some people in the hall and others in their room. The person I was rooming with was in someone else's room at the time, and I walked back into the hotel room. I remember sitting in there by myself, listening to the others walking in the hall and sort of just organizing my bags. I also remember noticing that the room clock was not the correct time, so I had to check my cell phone to get the real time. After what I thought to be only several minutes, the noise of people seemed to settle down, and I thought maybe they were all getting ready for dinner. I continued to sit in my room, and after another few minutes, I thought that the halls were just maybe too quiet. I didn't think that it was that late though, and that it was that close to dinner time, so I just sat there again. Then I heard as if someone just ran down the hall. It sounded to me like it came from the direction of the elevators and went down the hallway. I instantly thought it was just someone from the group just having a little fun because I heard the movement in the hall again. It sounded like it was at the end of the hall now. I got up because the sound went away, and I took that as the person possibly left for downstairs. I basically thought I should head downstairs for dinner, and with that, I left my room. As I walked, I thought I heard what sounded to be someone about to leave their room. It was like a doorknob was turning, and I heard some movement behind me. I remember sort of looking back to empty hallway, but I didn't think much about it. I went to the floor where the restaurant was on, and the group leaders were standing there. They caught sight of me and kind of laughed and told me I was late for dinner. I remember being confused and not thinking I was that late, but I saw that all the students in the group were already seated. I had to sit with the leaders that night for dinner, and they told me that they were wondering who was missing, but couldn't really decipher who it was. They stated I was gone for about 10 minutes. I just remember sitting there and thinking, who was in the hall and in that room then? I even told them at dinner I didn't think that I was that late because I heard what sounded like people still in their rooms and in the hall when I was on my way down to the elevator. They just looked at me somewhat amused and in wonder about what I was talking about, though they didn't really press me any further on my statements, and we just went on with dinner. I'm pretty sure no employees were in the hall because the hotel was pretty vacant when we were there. I probably saw about 5 employees downstairs when coming in, and throughout our first few hours there. And I'm just pretty sure no one would just go into someone's room like that. Another thing that happened was during our homestay portion of the trip. About 4 people were assigned to a family in a small village outside either Xi'an or Shanghai, and at each homestay, I was assigned with 3 other girls in the group, and we were taken to the house we would be staying at, which would only be for about 2 days. I shared a room with a girl named Millie for the duration of the homestay. The room was a good size, and there were 2 full-size beds in it. On our first night there, I was lying there and at some point, I dozed off but woke up again. I just continued to lay there trying to sleep again, but after a few seconds I heard what sounded like heavy, silent breathing. I thought it was Millie, but I realized it sounded like it was coming from behind me. At first it didn't scare me because I thought maybe it was the air conditioning kicking, but it went away after I turned my head to look at the AC. I laid there again and brought the covers closer to me, and then it felt as though, while during this, like someone had been pressing onto the end of the bed. Millie's bed pretty much less than 5 feet from mine, and I could see her while this was happening, so it wasn't her. I just laid there and tried to just let the feelings pass, but it felt like it stayed there. I didn't want to look at the end, but I couldn't help myself, but no one was there, nothing, it was just blank. I had a hard time getting to bed that night. I think maybe it was due to the constant traveling though. But after an hour or so after the bed and the breathing incident, the room got really dark, and I just pulled the covers over my head. There was another incident that happened in the house, and it was when I was upstairs alone. The 3 other girls were downstairs, and I had run back upstairs for something. I should note that the 4 of us had the second floor to ourselves, and we stayed in the 2 rooms upstairs. I was digging in my suitcase for whatever it was I needed, and remember hearing what sounded like someone being on the second floor. There was a sort of sitting area upstairs with a table, then the 2 rooms and a bathroom. The noise sounded like it was coming from the sitting area, and I thought maybe the family's son was upstairs. They had a 5-year-old son. I started to walk to the door since I thought maybe the son was playing with one of his toys, and that I came upstairs, but no one was there. I walked downstairs, and the girls and the mom of the family were there, and maybe 10 to 15 minutes after, her son came in the door with 2 friends. Probably the final thing to happen while in China was during our last portion of the trip. We were in Hong Kong for the last 2 days of the trip, and we were at the Kimberly Hotel. My roommate there was a girl named Maria. At one point in the first night, I went to take a shower. Maria had left some time beforehand, and I was in the bathroom. While showering, I heard someone speaking in the room, and at some point the voice came to the door of the bathroom. I quickly thought that Maria and someone else came back to the room, so I didn't think much of it. I got out, and while drying off, I heard the speaking again, but it sounded quieter. I opened the door to the room, and the room was empty. The first thing that came to my mind was maybe they left, but I would have heard the door open and close since the room door was right next to the bathroom. Then I thought it was the leaders doing their nightly checks, but it was far too early for that. I sat on my bed, and soon Maria came back, and the leaders came to do their room checks. I asked her while we were watching some TV show if she came into the room at all. She, of course, shook her head no, and stated that she went with a few other people to walk around a part of Hong Kong with. And no, the TV was not on. We didn't really watch TV. Mostly we would only watch TV to watch commercials and see how different they were from the USA's. Was my house in China haunted by partying spirits? A bit of backstory. I grew up in China. I'm Aussie, from the ages of 6 to 16, and we moved around quite a lot due to my father's job. Lived in tons of cities and houses. Never had any uneasy feeling about any one of them until we moved into this last house. It was a 3-story house. Ground floor was a superficial living room, used only when guests came over. Kitchen, dining, computer room, 2 bathrooms, laundry, and the maid's quarters. Small bedroom and bathroom behind the laundry. Second story was parents' room and the TV room. 2 balconies, saw down to the first level from here. Third floor was 3 kids' rooms and 2 bathrooms. I am describing this house because we rarely used the first floor at night after dinner, as all the entertainment was upstairs, and because of the balconies. Parents used to entertain a lot on the weekends. Parties, music, BBQ, the lot. And the house wasn't that old either, to what I can remember. New development site. We were probably the second family to live there. I just remember the house not feeling right. And I'm not a very spiritual person in the slightest. None of us kids like being downstairs on our own at night, if we had to perhaps make mom and dad a cup of tea, get a drink or something else. We would run back up the stairs as fast as we could, skipping steps and not turning around. I understand this is quite normal behavior for kids with their wild imaginations. You just got an eerie feeling being down there at night, especially in the kitchen. As it led off to the maid's room, I never went in there at night, even with the lights on and people in the kitchen only meters away. Not a lot of scary events happened. Just that I remember getting the chills if I had to go near the balconies or look down the staircase at night towards the first floor. I never saw anything. The only event is one that I actually think back on quite regularly, trying to explain it. Maybe I was sleepwalking, even though I've never done it before. Though I have been told I have sat up in my sleep and spoken. Anyways, one night, I was probably around 13 or 14 and staying up late. Cause I thought I was a badass staying up late, watching TV and trying on outfits for school the next day. I hadn't noticed when the sounds began, but I remember thinking, oh, didn't remember mom and dad saying they were having people over. What I heard was music playing distantly, as if it was coming from the first floor. I couldn't recall what song, only had a fast tempo. Thought I would just gander downstairs and say hello to everyone. Coming out of my room on the landing, all the lights in the house were on, and I could distinctly hear adults laughing and chatting. As I walked down to the second floor, the sounds, of course, increased as I got closer to the first floor. Walking down the last set of stairs, as soon as my eyes got to the level where they weren't blocked by the staircase above, the lights turned out, and the music and chatting stopped. I didn't step down off the stairs, only quickly walked back up to my parents' room to ask them if they had the music playing. I was trying to stay logical. I opened their door and they were asleep. I went back to my room and locked the doors and just sort of forgot about it until I just sort of thought of it again and got the chills. I also asked my parents about it in the morning, and they said no one was over and no music was playing because it was a school night. What I was wondering is if other people has had the same scared shitless feelings of their homes at night. Like, is it normal as a kid? I mean, I have no issues now, and if there is a simple explanation, like fatigue or something from staying up late, I'm a rational person and don't think it was the work of spirits. But just with the whole feel of the house, I can't ignore it. Thanks. White clothes. Good evening, everyone. Today is Halloween. I would like to share a real spooky story with you guys. which my auntie experienced by herself. It may be a little bit spooky. It happened when my auntie was about 20 years old. Now she is 50. Every time when she tells us this story, she still looks scared. It happened about 30 years ago when she was living in China with her husband. Because her husband was working there, the place where they were living at was a small house, which was old-fashioned style even without a toilet. People those days had to go to a public toilet even during the nights. The reason that my auntie chose there was because it had a very good view, and the house was by a river and lay in a beautiful area. She had been pregnant for nearly 5 months. One day at night, she wanted to go to the toilet, so she had to go to the public one, which was only 5 minutes by walk. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. There was no one on the streets, but she was not scared. Suddenly, she saw a man all in white walking in the front. She realized it was one of her neighbors who was working on a ship. She caught up with him and talked to him, but he didn't really say anything and looked very different. She felt something weird was going on, but didn't think too much of it. The next day, she met this man during the day, but he didn't know about anything last night. She felt it was very unusual, but he didn't look like he was lying at all. After that day, this man died from drowning because he fell into the river when he was working on the ship. As my auntie knew him, she went to visit his family. She saw his body, which was wearing all white, exactly the same as that night. Dead woman in the wall. This is a story my student told me. It is essentially not a ghost encounter, but it's on the same scale of the paranormal, and I truly believe it. About myself, I am a foreign expat who works and lives in Beijing, China. I have been to many countries around the globe, especially in Asia. I like to visit new places and gather information about the locals, and try to learn something about foreign cultures. I also had a great share of unexplainable things during my time as an expat. I never forced it, but somehow these things always came across me. The story I am about to tell changed my whole perspective on paranormal things, as well as on people in general. For more than 4 years now, I have been in China. I have found a job as an English teacher, which is an alright occupation in this country. Let me tell you the story. Well, I had a student last year, a 17-year-old kid named Yusha, who became very quickly a friend-type figure of mine simply because he was smart, sophisticated, and interested in the Western culture and language. I sadly cannot recall his Chinese name, which bugs me, but anyway, it is weird in China. Often you cannot tell what people think about you. Every expat can tell you that much about the Chinese culture. Chinese are so different from Western people. Still, me and Yusha came along just fine. Though the age and cultural difference was a bit of a problem from time to time. I am about 11 years older than him, and it was more like a typical teacher and student relationship. We didn't hang out together or anything like that. Still, some could say we were friends. I also met his parents once. But back to the story. I can remember sometime around spring to summer 2008, shortly before the Olympic Games, Yosha came to my class as usual. At about 3:30 in the afternoon, me and him were the only ones in the classroom. I asked how it was going and tried to ask him the usual questions. Oral English teachers try to get into conversations with their students. He interrupted me rather promptly to tell me something that happened to his father's friend. The father's friend had a terrible experience that he shared with Yusha's family just 2 days before school. This is the story I am about to tell. I said, okay, tell me what happened. And Yusha immediately responded with sentences like, you are not going to believe it, and I am so sure of it, and so on and so on. I interrupted and said, just tell me what happened. Okay, he said, and continued. Apparently, Yusha's father's friend bought a new apartment near Yunli, which is near Tiananmen Square, which is pretty much in the center of Beijing. Some foreign expats here may be heard of the place. It is near the Second Ring Road. As a side note, Chinese people don't like to rent places, they tend to buy apartments. Interesting enough, the place was dead cheap, 6,000 yuan for a square meter. The housing prices around this area are usually around 15,000 upwards, considering that the housing prices in Beijing at the time were skyrocketing. It was even weirder that this place came by so cheap. I bought myself a big flat with my wife together at the far west of Beijing, and I have to pay 1 million yuan in total. Each installment cost me 5,000 yuan a month, and is still going. The guy was of course delighted at first. He moved in with his wife and 4-year-old son. Everything seemed to be normal, when suddenly the son of that man started to act abnormally near the living room. There was nothing wrong with the room, but the child kept on crying and screaming as soon as he came near that room. The man was of course worried about him and tried to find a solution for a problem. As in so many cases, they took the kid to the doctor, and strangely enough, there was nothing wrong to be found with the kid. The father and the mother of the boy were worried that it might be a psychological problem, but the grandparents of the boy insisted to consult a feng shui master. Side note, it is really complicated to describe this kind of science. It is the science of nature, deals with qi, which means good and bad energy, yin and yang, etc. Please check Wikipedia for further information on the subject. We can assume it might be equivalent to our geomancers or shamans. After some consideration, the parents of the boy gave it a try. The fact that a deep-rooted respect for Chinese culture still persists in the minds of almost all Chinese people didn't make it a tough call anyways. My wife actually did the same when we moved in. Back to the story. As soon as the geomancer arrived, he instantly noticed that something was not good about that living room, so he used some devices, like the feng shui wheel, to gather enough info to discuss the next step. Meanwhile, the little boy who behaved so abnormal moved to the grandparents' house for precautions. The feng shui master finally decided that the wall between the living room and the dining room, that what was told to me, I don't recall the direct outlook of the apartment, must be torn down. Fair enough, said the boy's father, who told the story to Yushu's family. So after the geomancer left, the friend of Yushu's father decided to call some workers to tear down this wall. If a geomancer says so, usually there's no questions asked. The workers came by the apartment a few days later, and the father of the little boy was the first one to scrape off the wallpaper. What they found is something that can be best described as bizarre and horrible. I couldn't believe that myself at first. The workers found loose bricks behind the wallpaper stacked up onto each other. I mean, they were loose, no cement between them. They started to pull out each brick one by one, until they saw a plastic bag behind those brick layers. A terrible stench arose from it, and from this point on, I felt sick because I already had some kind of dark sense of foreboding what is about to happen. I was telling myself, what the fuck, in capital letters. Well, the workers opened up the bag and found a dead woman moored into the wall. I mean, what the fuck? This is terrible and beyond comprehension. The end of the story was that the pre-owner of that apartment killed his wife and moored her into the wall. He wanted to sell the apartment as quick as possible and get out of there quickly, and that explains the low price of the apartment. The police came later and took him into custody, etc. What is astounding about this story is not the cruel murder that happened. It was the little boy. Without him, nobody would have even noticed. Don't ask me what that is. I heard about the third eye that young children possess. The third eye is referred to term of seeing or feeling paranormal activities like ghosts, demons, portals, etc., but I never found any truth to this until Yosha told me that story. I consider myself a semi-believer now, though at that moment I was really skeptical. But I asked my student if he was telling the truth, and to be honest, he told me some pretty nasty family secrets before this event. I mean, he was very open to me and had never made a scam or lied to me in any way. I also talked to the father of the little boy just to confirm the whole story. He gave me more insight to it and told me some disgusting details about the decomposition of the body and so on, stuff that really doesn't add to the overall experience. Frankly, I don't care much if people believe me or not. Many of my friends say wow, but are never really willing to accept it. I am no liar. I do not need to lie about it. And I also don't want to claim any fame here on this board. I just want to know the truth. I read so many stories here and they have a lot of things in common. Maybe you can explain to me what happened to the kid. How did he sense it? I don't know. It's almost like a bad horror movie, but it actually happened and it still confuses the hell out of me. Mystery of the Chinese Man and Chinese Remains. This happened during the 70s. We lived in a house in Brakpan. During the time, we moved into a house which, along with all the other houses, was a new build. Strange things happened in our house. I was in primary school and 7 years old at that time. My brother was 2 years younger than me, and my baby sister at the time was only 1 year old. When I turned 9, my youngest sister was born. We stayed in that house for 6 years with my mom and dad. This is just a picture of the 6 years. Since we moved into that house, we experienced many strange things. At night, someone would come and sit on the end of my bed. I remember waking up thinking it was my mother or brother, and when I sat up to see who it was, there was no one there. I was not scared and got used to this someone sitting on my bed at night. My mother reassured me by telling me it was my guardian angel, and I believed her. Sometimes I would hear a small ball inside the cupboard fall, bounced a few times before it stopped bouncing. I ignored it, believing that it was my guardian angel like my mom told me. My mother was very scared at the time because my father worked shifts and she hated it when he had to work late shifts. My brother experienced the worst thing though. He would wake up screaming at night because of a ghost walking down the hallway past his bedroom. He said the ghost was a Chinese man without legs looking at him when passing his bedroom. When this happened, everybody was awake in the house with all the lights on. We were all anxiously waiting for my father to come home from his night shift. As the years went by, my brother got used to the Chinaman in the hallway. He just closed his door and slept with the light on. My mom and dad tried to comfort us by telling us it was our imagination. A couple years passed, and plans were made to build houses on a huge open field next to the suburb where we lived. My father was a traffic cop, and in those days the police, traffic cops, and even the undertakers knew everything that was going on in town because they worked together as a team and they knew each other very well. When the work started, and while digging foundations, Chinese remains were found. The remains were dug up, and I'm not sure if they were cremated or buried elsewhere. The mystery of the Chinese man in our house or the remains that were discovered were never solved. Nobody knows what happened. We still wonder about this Chinese man, and I still wonder who sat on my bed and who played with the ball. We moved away when I turned 15 years old. That was my first experience with strange happenings, but not the last. The Chinese blanket. Hello, this is Haley. This was a personal account retold to me by my uncle over early morning breakfast one day. About 40 years ago, when my uncle was still a young teen, he lived in China. One day, he ventured out into the woods with a good friend of his. The air was clear, and the weather was nice. Back in those days, the cities hadn't been developed yet. So, forests were thick, and you could basically walk in mountains and streams and woods for miles on end. Eventually, amongst their juvenile pranks and kidding around, my uncle and his friend were suddenly shocked by what they saw in front of them. Overhead, flying above the trees, just a bit off ground level, was a white blanket. Very similar to the stereotypical ghosts you see in cartoons or drawings, just a white blanket, with no distinct shape or features flying above the trees in a very far off direction. The entity did not see them or acknowledge their existence in any way, but the almost transparent flying thing swooshing above the trees, believed to be alive, was enough to scare my uncle and his friends out of those woods.